Chapter 12 The Kibbutzim.
Bruno Bettelheim was fond of saying that there is no reason why we cannot make provision for children to divorce themselves from their families, as adults divorce one another. Superscript 1. Beginning in the 1950s, he grew increasingly interested in the Kibbutzim, where thousands of children had, in fact, grown up in significant ways divorced from their parents. Most of these agricultural settlements in Palestine and then Israel had required that parents turn over their infants to a appelé, a caregiver charged with looking after a child's daily needs. In most cases, these appelés helped raise the children through high school. The youngsters grew up in special houses apart from their parents and spent most of their time together. They visited with their mothers and fathers at the end of most working days and on weekends, and parents sometimes came to the children's house to read at bedtime and say goodnight. But the center of each child's daily life was his appelé and his kibbutza, the peers with whom he lived. The kibbutz pioneers had established this separation in the second decade of the century as part of their movement to create a new society on the land. One of humane and just socialist collectives that would put an end not only to capitalistic materialism but to the patriarchal and often smothering family life of the urban ghettos and the shtetls of Eastern Europe and Russia, from which most had come. They had migrated to Palestine to build a Zionist utopia where women and men could work as equals. In this Sparta, the bone-wearying demands of farming and the constant threat from hostile Arabs left little time for the ordinary hug of family life. In the early years especially, the children were kibbutzniks first and sons and daughters second, a message they absorbed as they drifted off to sleep each night in a room full of age mates. Overseen by an ard, this unique social experiment attracted the interest of several American social scientists and psychotherapists, among them Bruno Bettelheim's friend David Rappaport. In 1957, at a workshop on kibbutz child rearing at the annual meeting of the American Orthopsychiatric Association, the Austin Riggs psychologist delivered a paper lamenting the paucity of research dealing with the kibbutzim, which by then numbered about 220, with a total of about 80,000 inhabitants, roughly 4% of Israel's population. Rappaport, like others at the gathering, saw in the radical departure from ordinary upbringing a rich field of study, creating a burning need to learn how these kibbutz sabers fared. The anecdotal evidence suggested that, on the whole, they were growing up to be healthy and well-adjusted. A hard-working and loyal cohort devoted to perpetuating the founders' ideals, squared by John Bulby and others, adherents of attachment culture because they had not received enough conventional mothering. Bettelheim had never been to Israel, but he discussed these issues with Rappaport and others, and corresponded with Nechama Levi Edelman, a member of Ramat Yohanan, a kibbutz about 10 miles east of Haifa. A social worker and teacher, she had been impressed by Love Is Not Enough and was eager to spend time at the orthogenic school. In 1956, when the counselor Phelan told Bettelheim she needed to take some time off and was planning to spend a month in Israel, he asked her to look up Levi Edelman, who both thought was a man. He was playing Shanshan, fixing me up, because I was having problems with a relationship, recalled Lon, who disembarked from her ship in Haifa to be greeted not by a potential spouse, but by a big-boned Earth mother. Lon spent 2 weeks at Ramat Yohanan and was drawn to her warm hostess, whose peasant features and concern for children made her something of the matriarch at the kibbutz, where she had lived since 1940. I told Drive B, invite this lady, she's only wonderful. In 1957, Levi Edelman spent about 2 months observing at the orthogenic school and came away full of admiration for the therapeutic milieu Bettelheim and his dedicated staff had fostered. Like others, she found the director difficult, but felt that in order to learn from him it had been worth putting up with his hard side. Cubed in 1959, the year Bettelheim first wrote about Joey, the mechanical boy. He also staked his claim as an expert on kibbutz child rearing. The year before, Melford Spiro, a professor of anthropology at the University of Washington, had published Children of the Kibbutz, a book based on fieldwork he and his wife had conducted while living on one for 13 months in 1951 to 52. Bettelheim, without ever having visited a kibbutz, reviewed Children for Instructionist. at once deriding Spiro's weaknesses and limitations and using the author's considerable research to advance his own agenda. The kibbutzniks, Bettelheim wrote, had created a system that pays off and pays off handsomely, one that had produced children who view their parents casually and amiably, but with neither much love nor respect. These parents, or at least those who had been reared on the kibbutzim themselves, had given up their babies to the murder plot without any doubt or hesitation, and, having a full life of their own, did not miss having their children's emotions centering around them. The lesson, Bettelheim said, was as obvious as it was at the orthogenic school. If we remove from the lives of our children are not necessarily the worse off for it, perhaps even much better off. Bettelheim would come to question their original ties. But, he predicted, this was not likely the move of the future. In 1962, Bettelheim stepped forward again as an authority on the kibbutz, lifting passages from his Reconstructionist article and setting them down virtually unaltered in commentary. The relations of kibbutz-educated children to each other and to their parents are amazingly uncomplicated, straightforward, and erotic, although Spiro often claims the reverse is true. But, and here is the rub, therefore quite lacking in intensity by comparison. The Reconstructionist. But though the relations of kibbutz-educated children to their parents and to each other are amazingly uncomplicated, straightforward, and unerotic, they are at the same time, and here is the rub, comparatively lacking in intensity. Commentary. Bettelheim reported in both articles that this putative lack of intensity was viewed with alarm by both researchers and kibbutz parents, but that he saw little cause for concern. As he put it in the Reconstructionist, blood simply is not thicker than the shared emotional experiences. It is these which tie people together. To his commentary readers he explained, blood simply is not thicker than shared emotional experiences. It is the latter that tie people together. In commentary, Bettelheim expressed a certain sheepishness about never having been to Israel, conceding that his knowledge was not first-hand. He listed a few journal articles and books that he said he had consulted, among them Spiro's study. In addition, he wrote, I have had conversations over a long period of time with persons who spent some years as educators in the kibbutz movement. Some, still active in their posts, visited with us for months at a time at the orthogenic school. Others, who had left the kibbutz, worked with us, and others still, who had been originally with us and left to teach in the kibbutz, later returned to report their experiences. At the time Bettelheim wrote these words. The only kibbutznik who had been at the school for more than the few weeks that Nechama Levi Edelman had visited was Itamar Yahalom, who had worked with disturbed children in Israel. Yahalom, who joined Bettelheim's staff in 1956 and stayed for 4 years, did not retain his kibbutz position after he arrived in Chicago. If any staff members left the school to teach on kibbutzim, whether to return or not, neither Yahalom nor Phalon can remember them. To Bettelheim, all available evidence demonstrated that kibbutz education was an unequivocal success. Reports to the contrary by American observers like Spiro were fatally flawed by a bias in favor of traditional child-rearing ability development. Some therapists or the Orthodox family. However, nowhere in Children of the Kibbutz did Spiro express approval or disapproval of the settlement's child-rearing practices. Bettelheim wrote in commentary that his examination of the whole body of data had convinced him that what the kibbutzniks had accomplished should lead Americans to reconsider their own assumptions and values throughout the entire field of education. Superscript 1. He did not specify what should be re-examined or make any recommendations. And by the time he reached his final paragraph seemed to have developed misgivings about the sweep of his conclusions. He wrote that he was not urging that the United States adopt the system of education he had just finished lauding, only proposing that Americans take education as seriously as the kibbutzniks. Superscript 1. By 1963, Bettelheim was planning a book about kibbutz child-rearing. And after receiving a grant from the New World Foundation, he arranged with Nechama Levi Edelman to visit Ramat Yohanan. Few of the kibbutz's 300 members besides her knew much about Bruno Bettelheim. And when she discussed the purpose of his visit with the leaders, they were wary of stepping into his petri dish. Nonetheless, at her urging, they agreed to open doors for him. He arrived in March 1964 and, with Levi Edelman as his guide, began 5 weeks of non-stop investigation. He observed the children in their classrooms, in their special houses, and at mealtimes. He handed out questionnaires and recorded daily interviews with kibbutzniks young and old, mailing the tapes back to Linnea Brandwein and other transcribers at the orthogenic school. Early on, Bettelheim made it clear how he viewed the kibbutz system of raising children. In an interview with the Israeli Navy's chief psychologist, he said he had little patience with the notion that kibbutz education is so bad because the dear mothers are not all the time with their dear little ones. Superscript 1 squared at 60, Bettelheim was older than Levi Edelman and hardly as robust as his son who had lived the hard kibbutz life for 24 years. But at the end of each day it was she who was exhausted from trying to match his pace and meet his constant demands. There were days when he made me really nervous, she recalled. When he wanted something, the wishes of others didn't exist. One Friday afternoon, his typewriter broke down, and he insisted on going to Haifa the next day to have it repaired. Levi Edelman explained that everything would be closed because of the Sabbath, but he was determined, and she knew that if she refused to take him it would only make her life more difficult. They went, and after much searching found someone to fix the machine, a trial of the city to even the most mundane task. So, her guest assured her that despite his sometimes exasperating behavior he loved and appreciated her. To others, he complained that she was an inferior teacher and therapist who had been unable to learn under his tutelage during her brief stay at the eugenic school in 1957. Superscript 1 cube Levi Edelman herself had been really frightened of, and deferential to, the famously intimidating author of Love Is Not Enough during her weeks at the school. But she was 7 years older now and on her own turf, and as Bettelheim went about his research at Ramat Yohan and he found her bossy and manipulative. Superscript 1 during a meeting of educators in her home. He said several times that it seemed to him the Israelis were proud of the capitalist advantages they had achieved since becoming a nation in 1948. Levi Edelman demurred, insisting that the pride was in the Histadrut, the country's labor federation. Yes, said Bettelheim, but I cannot see any difference if the factory is owned by the Histadrut or by a private capitalist. Well, replied Levi Edelman, then you have to learn the difference. Superscript 1 on another occasion, while they were talking with several teachers, she asked what he would do if his son, Eric, who was then 12, decided he wanted to have a bar mitzvah. The question upset him, and he demanded to know who gave her permission to raise such a matter. Superscript 1 This exchange exposed what Levi Edelman saw as the tragic aspect of Bettelheim's visit. His impulse to bury his Jewishness, even, or perhaps especially, in the haven of the Promised Land. From the moment he arrived, he had resisted seeing anything of the country. Finally, his hostess decided that he needed to put his work aside for a few hours and go with her on a tour of the Galilee. When she hired a taxi, he reluctantly agreed to the trip, and they set out together with Charles D. Sharp, a filmmaker who had shot movies at the orthogenic school for several years and had come to Ramat Yohan to record footage that Bettelheim hoped to use with lectures when he returned to the United States. Their first stop was at Capernaum, the site on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee where, the New Testament records, Jesus established a ministry and found St. Peter and several other disciples among the community's fishermen. Levi Edelman wanted to show Bettelheim and Sharp this place, called Kafar Nahum in Hebrew, because of its rich archaeological store of both Christian and Jewish symbols. Among them the traces of fresco work at the house of St. Peter and the ruins of an imposing synagogue dating to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. The morning was clear and cool. The setting idyllic and intrigued the student of art history from Vienna, who marveled. But Bettelheim seemed to be going through the motions at best, like a recalcitrant teenager on a high school field trip. I had such a hard time, recalled Levi Edelman. If it hadn't been Bettelheim, I would have thrown him out of the taxi. They argued constantly as she rubbed his nose in the Jewish past all over them. Again and again, he pleaded with her to leave his feelings on this subject alone. At Nazareth, Bettelheim made a point of visiting several churches, prompting Levi Edelman to twit him for his desire to become a Christian. An aspiration it seemed to her he manifested further when, on the drive back to Ramat Yohanan at day's end, he announced that Jesus Christ was the greatest educator who had ever lived. Levi Edelman was appalled that a Jew could feel this way, and once again Charles Sharp found himself dodging the ricochets as his companion's furious quarrel filled the taxi. They were shouting at each other, he told me. It was the goddamn desk fight. Passover began at the end of March, not long after Bettelheim arrived. And as happened every year, several hundred members of the kibbutz and their guests packed into the main dining hall for a giant seder. Bettelheim resisted attending, but when Edelman pressed him he relented, and sat with her and her family to drink the kiddush wine, break the matzo, eat the bitter herbs, and ask what made this night different from all other nights. When exuberant song filled the hall at the event's end, Levi Edelman was astonished to hear her reluctant celebrant hesitantly join the others in Havi Megillah, which salutes the Jews' return to their ancient soil. She told me that when the voices died down he confided that when he was a boy he had studied at Hadar, the traditional school where instruction in Judaism was given in the home of the teacher, usually a Rebbe. This revelation was at odds with everything he had ever said about his intensely secular upbringing in Vienna, and likely was produced, like his tentative singing, both to mollify his proselytizing hostess and to make himself feel less alien in the festive crowd. Whatever Bettelheim's private strategies, there was no question in Levi Edelman's mind that he had been touched by the ceremony, and that he was moved further several days later when members of Ramat Yohanan reconvened in the dining hall to mark Yom HaShoah, the annual Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, which the government had established as a formal holiday only 5 years before. Again Bettelheim pulled back, and again his self-appointed tutor pushed him forward. I said, "Drive B, you have to come." This is the one took him to the hall. And the four, his head bowed as solemn music filled the room and survivors rose to tell their stories. He did not say a word, but I saw tears in his eyes, Levi Edelman told me. Bettelheim would never write or declare publicly that his experiences in Israel had put a crack in the assimilationist carapace that so long ago had hardened around him. But, if only a hairline, it was now there. Among those who came to sense it was Leonard Atkins, who had arrived in Israel from his native Cape Town in 1951 at age 23, attracted to the utopianism of the kibbutz movement. By the time of Bettelheim's visit in 1964, the idealistic South African had become co-director of a residential treatment center for emotionally disturbed kibbutz children. Bettelheim spent a day there observing them and was impressed by Atkins's dedication. That evening, at a meeting with the staff, he announced, without looking at the co-director and with typical dramatic flair, that a position awaited him at the orthogenic school if he wanted it. 2 years later, Atkins, his wife, Miriam, and their 2 children resettled in Hyde Park, where he became a teacher and therapist at the school for the next 5 years. Atkins admired much about Bettelheim, but found offensive his insistence on celebrating only Christian holidays at the school. They never entered a dialogue on the matter, because the director did not invite dialogue. But the subject of Jewishness did surface occasionally. He would say, Atkins told me, that there is a sort of arrogance in remaining different from the people in your host country, and that assimilation was the solution. And I would say that I didn't think cultural suicide was the answer. Bruno listened. He didn't engage, but he listened. He also seemed to hear when Atkins talked wistfully of the beauty and vigor of Passover services in Israel. Finally, after 25 years as head of the school, Bettelheim permitted a celebration of a Jewish holiday on the premises. This Seder, which Atkins organized in 1969, was a major undertaking that involved the entire school, Jew and Gentile alike. Since Bettelheim had given the observance his tacit blessing, Atkins assumed he would participate. But the director begged off, saying in an offhand fashion that a previous commitment made it impossible for him to attend, an excuse that would have been unthinkable at Christmas time. Atkins told me he was deeply hurt by the director's absence, but feels nonetheless that his willingness to countenance the Seder at all flowed from
the first time he had seen a thing like the subservient or overcompensating stereotypes that had filled his head since childhood and had been given terrifying reinforcement in Dachau and Buchenwald. At Ramat Yohanan, he came face to face with Jews who were determining their own fate, often under difficult circumstances. Paradoxically, it was assimilation that had helped give these Israelis their strength. They had created a nationality and had developed a culture of their own, and within the borders of their new state they no longer faced daily reminders, as did Bettelheim and all other Jews in even such tolerant corners of the diaspora as Hyde Park, that they belonged to a minority. Bettelheim would become a strong supporter of Israel. When the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, he rushed to Hillel House with a check for $500. Superscript 17 in subsequent years. He worried more and more over the country's future, an agony reflected repeatedly in his correspondence with Nancy Dayton, the former student who had lived in Israel, and Carl Frankenstein, the psychoanalyst and teacher who had emigrated to Palestine from Berlin in 1935 and whom Bettelheim befriended during his 1964 visit. There seems to be no end to the trials of the Jews, he wrote to Frankenstein just after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, in a typical lament. Superscript 18 a year later. He told Dayton that Israel's plight in a hostile Arab world reminded him too much of his experience at the hands of the Nazis. I feel very hopeless in the long run. Superscript 1 in 1969, Bettelheim published The Children of the Dream, his book about child rearing and education on the Kibbutzim in general and at Ramat Yochanan in particular. He acknowledged that his research had been hampered because he spoke and understood only a few words of Hebrew. Superscript 2 degrees. However, he insisted that this deficiency was not a significant drawback in communicating with adult Israelis, because many of them spoke English and he had communicated with others in German, French, and the smattering of Yiddish that he understood. He conceded that his lack of Hebrew was a serious handicap in interviewing the children, that even those who spoke some English did so haltingly and were inevitably unresponsive to the nuances of this foreign language. Superscript 2 superscript 1 Nevertheless, he maintained that it did not faze him that these youngsters were his principal subjects and that his mostly translated interactions with them provided the primary grist for many of his observations. I hope, he wrote, that what I lost out on by my ignorance of Hebrew was compensated for by an intimate knowledge of the rearing of children away from their parents. As a matter of fact, wanting to study kibbutz rearing was the reports I struck from their mothers. These reports I could not accept, having for some 20 years directed a center where children are brought up not by their parents, but by professional educators, and to the children's advantage. Thus I felt I was in a better position than most to evaluate the assets and liabilities of group rearing, and that this, in the long run, might be as important for understanding such a method of education as it would be to command the language of the children. Superscript 2 superscript 2 in this boast of expertise, Bettelheim made no distinction between the normal farm kids he interviewed and observed on the Kibbutzim and the emotionally troubled children at the orthogenic school. On page 8 of The Children of the Dream, the author termed the book a very personal, impressionistic report. On page 13 he described it as a study in depth, and in an appendix entitled The Data he wrote of the considerable subjective information that he had collected. He placed objective in quotation marks, by which he seemed to be signaling that such detachment is an unachievable ideal. The emphasis also suggests the conscious or unconscious irony of a man who knew that once again he was plowing the fields of as if. Superscript 2 superscript 3 in the book's first sentence, he wrote that he had studied the Kibbutzim for 7 weeks. Superscript 2 4 though by his own word, and necessarily by Edelman's as well. He spent only 5 weeks in Israel. Superscript 2 5 The evidence in his papers at the University of Chicago shows that during those 35 days he interviewed about 50 individuals and participated in several meetings with groups of both children and adults, most of which like the interviews he recorded on tape. In all, these encounters produced some 800 pages of transcripts, and they confirm Edelman's description of the busy pace Bettelheim set for himself. For the book, though, it was not busy enough. There he wrote that he had interviewed several hundred persons, some for more than 20 hours, superscript to 6, and that he had come home to thousands of pages of transcripts. Superscript to 7 such exaggeration bobs on a sea of prose that, like most of the author's previous works, lacks any systematic source notes, producing a vague scholarship blurred further by the dense fog of anonymity that envelopes the book. Bettelheim disguised Dramatic by calling it était, which means future in Hebrew. He maintained that his interviewees had requested such protection superscript to 8, and some may have, but Levi Edelman told me that neither she nor the other leaders had asked their guests to mask either their or the kibbutz's identities. Bettelheim thanked Levi Edelman for her generous help, but identified her only as his interpreter and this person superscript to, nor did he name any actor in Israel, except for when Atkins read portions of the manuscript. By 1969, such camouflage had become the standard Bettelheim technique, allowing him to call the dots on his blank dice, to make it seem, as Charles Rickroft had put it, as if he had a private line to the truth, or, as Dwight MacDonald had written in reviewing Love Is Not Enough, that the Mountie always got his man. For more than a quarter of a century, from his descriptions of the nameless prisoners in Dachau and Buchenwald in individual and mass behavior in extreme situations, to his dialogues with unidentified mothers, and through his 3 books about the orthogenic school, with their dramatic pseudonymous vignettes and case histories, he almost never identified the subjects of his psychological scrutiny. He argued, as did most of his professional colleagues, that the patient's privacy must be maintained at all cost, but he, like they, rarely discussed the temptations of the canvas of anonymity. In The Children of the Dream, Bettelheim didn't bother with pseudonyms. Instead, he attributed the more than 60 quotations he deployed to such sources as an educator, page 79, a leading educator, page 40, a kibbutz-born social worker, page 272, or a left-wing metaphor who had cared for many generations of babies from birth to 6 months, page 95. On page 106, he offered the veiled voices of a young woman, one of her lodge-mates, and a mother. In another passage, he supplied a quotation from a group of educators that ran to 205 words, page 102. The book is made all the more opaque by its inconsistencies, contradictions that moved one frustrated critic to ask, will the real Bruno Bettelheim please stand up? Superscript 3 degrees. He wrote, for example, that by and large kibbutz-born youngsters seem to show considerably less emotional disturbance, both in number of cases and severity, than would a comparable group in the United States. Yet his next paragraph begins, my judgment, however, rests on shaky grounds. Because of the uncertainty of what would be a comparable group in America. Superscript 3 superscript 1 elsewhere, he stressed the importance of studying the kibbutz because it proceeds within the framework of a democratic society involving people very much like ourselves. Superscript 3 superscript 2 36 pages later, he wrote that it is hard to visualize how we could duplicate the kibbutz in our pluralistic society. Superscript 3 superscript 3 on the one hand, Bettelheim liked what he saw at Ramat Yohanan, concluding that group child rearing away from mothers seemed quite successful. Superscript 3 for yet he maintained that the babies born in the settlements developed into adolescent and depleted. Superscript 3 6 personality breaking parents. To support this view, Bettelheim offered scant evidence. Instead, he most often made his case with the kind of aggressive priority that by now had become his trademark. In a principal conclusion, he maintained that the youngsters had repressed their feelings in part because of the leveling impact of kibbutz education and in part because their communal upbringing had given them a collective rather than an individual ego. Without the peer group they are lost, he declared. Superscript 3-7 explaining that the kibbutz had made the second generation emotionally dull. Page 232 had made them reluctant to touch or be touched. Page 239 uneasy in marriage and with their children. Page 246 estranged from the world of ideas. Page 285 even downright xenophobic. Page 230 He often buttressed such pronouncements with his blind quotations, like that of a teacher who he said had been a kibbutznik and now taught in the city as well as at a kibbutz. He said this ephemeral source told him, "I tried all kinds of methods of teaching the adolescents to be spontaneous, to be creative in their writings. The methods that worked in the city schools did not work in the kibbutz. When I encouraged them, the children in the kibbutz wrote eagerly, but they would never read out what they wrote in front of the class, nor would they show it to the other youngsters. Superscript 3.8 Even on the rare occasion when Bettelheim supplied statistics, he didn't reveal where they came from, as with a nationwide study that made the leveling impact of kibbutz education quite apparent. Superscript 3 At the time the children of the dream appeared, the kibbutz seemed fertile ground for such freewheeling analysis. No large, meaningful studies existed from which significant conclusions could be drawn about the overall impact of the settlement's child-rearing practices for degrees, creating a seductive tabula rasa for the anecdotal approach. Bettelheim seemed to recognize this hazard when he wrote, toward the end of his book, that any useful judgment about the efficacy of kibbutz education would have to wait until the third generation matured. That until then his observations must be regarded as tentative, very open to question, beset by uncertainties. For superscript 1 This caution may have been well meant, but, coming as it did after almost 300 pages of seat of the pants research couched far less humbly, it registers much like the author's last-minute song to guiltless mothers at the end of The Empty Fortress. Certainly it did not mollify many in the kibbutz movement, who found the children of the dream filled with, in the words of Mordecai Kaufman, a lot of block. When Bettelheim visited Israel in 1964, his children at Oranim, the native of Santiago, Chile, where he attended medical school. He had come to Palestine in 1947 at age 30 and helped found Ramat Menashe, the kibbutz near Tel Aviv, where he and his wife still lived and their 3 children grew up. By the time I interviewed him, Kaufman had become a leading authority on kibbutz children, the medical director and chief psychiatrist of the Kibbutz Child and Family Clinic in Tel Aviv, and the author or co-author of some 150 articles in professional journals and books. Kaufman had first met Bettelheim during a brief visit to the orthogenic school when studying child psychiatry in the United States from 1958 to 1961. Like most others, he had found the director a man hard to ignore, a true believer who seemed to have no place for doubt. Still, the confident sweep of the children of the dream had left him astonished and dismayed. When we talked in his small office, he had the book in hand and turned at random to several passages that he called nonsense, such as Bettelheim's contention that there was great community pressure on mothers to cease nursing when their infants reached 6 months of age, pages 75 to 76, that the kibbutz founders would feel enslaved by the reestablishment of deep emotional family ties, page 94, that, unlike children elsewhere, kibbutz youngsters did not push and hit one another from time to time, page 175, that there were no schizophrenics among the kibbutz-born, page 196. Kaufman also dismissed Bettelheim's generalized thesis that second-generation kibbutzniks were emotionally shallow compared with their parents, reiterating what he had written not long before we spoke, that studies made both before and after Bettelheim's 1964 study demonstrate that kibbutz children and adolescents revealed neither a homogeneous or a psychiatric problems. For superscript 2 Beyond that, Kaufman stressed that comparing the 2 generations at all was at best a dubious enterprise. The strong-willed Jews from a distinct shtetl or ghetto culture in Russia or Europe. Settlers imbued with great socialist idealism and a willingness to break the land. This self-selected band constituted no more than 4% of the thousands of migrants who had come to Palestine in the first half of the century. Their children, inevitably, were unselected, a homogeneous population, raised in a common system that was bound to produce adolescents less varied and engaged than their founder parents. With the agitation of a scientist frustrated by having to point out the obvious, Kaufman told me that it was impossible, totally impossible, for any human mortal to write a thoughtful, book-length study of kibbutz child rearing after a visit of only a few weeks, even if he had spoken fluent Hebrew. What further angered Kaufman and not a few other kibbutz leaders including nephew by Edelman, was the conviction that Bettelheim had arrived in Israel with his mind made up. He didn't need the few weeks. The book was already constructed. Nothing could change his views, Kaufman said. By the time The Children of the Dream appeared in 1969, it had been 10 years since Bettelheim had declared, without any first-hand investigation, that the kibbutz system of child rearing and education had paid off handsomely, producing healthy youngsters who regarded their parents with neither much love nor respect. Parents so focused on the needs of the kibbutz that they had given up their babies to the medic lot without any misgivings. The Children of the Dream is less reductive, but its message is essentially the same, that, in terms of importance to the child, the peer group comes first, the kibbutz itself second, and the parents only last. For Q, the literature on kibbutz child rearing makes clear that the reverse is true. That even in the early years of the movement it had become apparent that relations between members could not substitute for family ties. 44 or, as another observer put it the year after The Children of the Dream came out, parents and children are deeply attached to each other and comprise a distinct and recognizable social group. 45 Chai later, the wife of an Israeli consulate official in Chicago, had been a mené at a kibbutz in the Western Galilee for 27 years, in a settlement where the couple's 3 children grew up. In a 1969 newspaper interview, she waved away Bettelheim's picture of kibbutz mothering as unrecognizable. The judgment the headline writer summed up as a Jewish mother replies, "Boy." 46 When Bettelheim was still writing his book, in the late 1960s, the desire of kibbutz parents to have their children sleep at home had begun to grow. This impulse, which in 1959 Bettelheim had predicted would fade, continued to gain in the 1980s. By the beginning of the 1990s, only 3 of Israel's 260 kibbutzim. 47 to Bettelheim, when he spoke to the general meeting of Ramat Yovinan at the end of his stay. He criticized the parents for constantly looking over the shoulders of the medic lot. 48 Getting mothers and fathers out of the picture had long been central to Bettelheim's treatment philosophy at the orthogenic school, but his visit to Israel gave him a new agenda. At the outset of The Children of the Dream, he suggested that poor children in the United States might well profit from a similar divorce. "The feeling is widespread," he wrote, citing no one, "that if we are to help the culturally deprived child, whether in city slums or impoverished rural areas, he had best be reared in an environment different from his home. Since his home life often makes him unfit for the world he must later enter." For he conceded that America's poor mothers might prove more reluctant than their kibbutz counterparts to part with their offspring. Nonetheless, he felt that, given the kibbutz success, such a radical change would best resolve the problem of our slums, and in short order. 5 degrees in promoting the book, Bettelheim rooted this idea about in speeches and interviews, attacking Project Head Start in particular. This federal enrichment program for deprived preschoolers was a popular and often successful ingredient of the societies, but Bettelheim argued that a terrible strain is created when you take children out of the ghettos for a few hours each day and teach them how to adapt to a middle-class learning pattern which is entirely different from the skill they need to survive in the jungle of their home environment. 5 Superscript 1 As an alternative, he proposed taking infants from poor parents just after birth and placing them in an American version of the kibbutz children's house, where they would remain until age 18. He commanded that 2 such institutions be established as an experiment, each caring for 100 to 150 children and staffed by specially trained caregivers. Parents would be able to visit their offspring for a few hours each day. He assured one interviewer. 5 Superscript 2 Not only were the kibbutzim fast moving away from such arrangements, but Israelis who came to observe Project Head Start left particularly impressed by the heavy parental commitment. Sylvia Crown, the research psychologist at Hebrew University, noted approvingly that the program required that one staff member work with parents at each center and that parents make up half of each center's advisory committee. She regarded this and other efforts to get parents more involved in their young children's education well worth emulating in Israel. 5 Superscript 3 In 1969, Sarah Look, chief inspector of nursery schools and kindergartens in Israel, toured several Project Head Start centers and also came away with the conviction her country would do well to encourage the kind of parental involvement she had witnessed. 50 For Bettelheim's contrary view of how to save the children of the inner city jungle did not originate or end with him. In the mid-1990s, the fractious, right-wing Republican leader Newt Gingrich, citing Boys Town as a model, urged a nationwide resurrection of orphanages so that impoverished children could be separated from the pernicious influence of their parents and the crime and drug-infested neighborhoods where they live. For a conservative politician, such a proposal has an easy attraction. It sounds simple and humane. We just want to help these kids. And it avoids facing the racial and economic injustice that created the crisis, not to mention the heavy taxation required to ameliorate it. As early as 1946, Bettelheim had made clear that he well understood this dimension of the problem, writing that good housing, full employment and a feeling of financial security in general were crucial in any fight against intolerance. 55 He echoed this theme for years later in Dynamics of Prejudice, and again, in 1964, when that study was reprinted with new introductory material as Social Change and Prejudice. 56 When writing The Children of the Dream, Bettelheim key factor in any effort to reduce racism, and as he urged the kibbutz approach for ghetto children, he gave such hard correctives scant attention. Even though economic leveling is at the socialist heart of kibbutz life, Bettelheim also seemed to have forgotten, in criticizing Project Head Start, that on at least 2 occasions he had urged the creation of just such a program. In 1958, he proposed that 5-year-olds from poor homes attend small preparatory classes in which they would be encouraged to learn by the very best teachers. 57 In 1964, he insisted that there must be radical reform in the school lives of children between the ages of 2 and 5. Why, he asked rhetorically, are we so blind to the fact that all our educational planning for the underprivileged begins when for all practical purposes it is too late? 58 Bettelheim's 1969 dismissals of Project Head Start's attempt to address just this question would seem baffling, were he not so often inconsistent. He was not the scholar who had revised his ideas in light of new information and after careful thought, and who offered reasons for his change of mind, but one of those university professors who, he himself had suggested, get far because they are glib. 5 He often talked in half ideas. 6 degrees, but they carried like the pitch of a marker who knows what will draw the crowd to his tent on the midway. The wide-eyed fairgoers had seen the feral mothers, the mechanical boy, the miraculous cure for autism. Now they could step inside and watch ghetto kids have a parentectomy. Most reviewers who knew anything about Project Head Start, the Kibbutzim, or child psychology in general saw through the pitchman. They found much in The Children of the Dream grossly oversimplified 6 superscript 1 and criticized its author for trying to force his unsupported conclusions into a Procrustean bed of theory. 6 squared Menachem Jerson, director of ORANIM, the Kibbutz Movement's teaching seminary, observed that Bettelheim's easy generalizations give the reader no knowledge about the records of kibbutz youngsters' diaries, group conversations, and artistic achievements. Despite his great appreciation of the kibbutz, the author is doomed to mislead his readers. 6 superscript 3 Jerson laid out his views in Israel Horizons, and most other criticism of Bettelheim's book surfaced in publications of similarly lower profile, such as Children, Conservative Judaism, and the Hudson Review. Meanwhile, the mainstream media once again gathered outside the author's tent and amplified his spiel. He promoted the book on the Today Show, and gave numerous newspaper interviews, including to the New York Times, one of which introduced him as one of the world's outstanding authorities on childhood emotional development. Treated the book favorably. 65 and the Tribune, and that called the work a brilliant contribution to the study of communal child rearing of the Israeli kibbutz. 66 Christopher Lehman Haupt, the daily book critic of the New York Times, called Bettelheim a pioneer in the exploration of childhood emotional development and disorder, and his book a painstaking examination of kibbutz children's growth. He concluded his review by noting that the book, like the author's proposal for resolving the problems in the slums, was something to think about. 67 in the New York Times Book Review, the social and political scientist Paul Rosen called Bettelheim an ardent clinician who stood as one of Freud's few genuine heirs of our time. Perhaps no one, he wrote, was more equipped to assess the effects of kibbutz society on personality formation than Bruno Bettelheim. 68 Like a number of people initially dazzled by the man and his prose, Rosen would have second thoughts. Not long after he reviewed The Children of the Dream, he became a parent for the first time and grew a good deal more skeptical about Bettelheim's outsider approach to traditional family life. Rosen admired Freud and recognized that Bettelheim was acting in the master's wake, and he conceded that there were times when a child and his parents could benefit from the intervention of a neutral observer. But as a father himself, he became suspicious of all the pretends to expertise in an area of thinking so filled with conflicting ideological convictions. 6 others came to share Rosen's reservations. But in 1969, The Children of the Dream only increased Bettelheim's visibility as a seer with unique insight into the troubled psyches of the young, a visibility that would grow even greater as he took students protesting the Vietnam War and the inequities of American society.